What happens when the empath stops pleasing everyone? There comes a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when the empath stops, not because they have hardened, not because they have stopped caring, but because something inside them finally asks, "What about me?" For a long time, the empath learned that love had conditions. Love was earned by being useful, by being understanding, by being the one who never said no. People pleasing is often praised as kindness, but in many cases it begins as something far more primal. It is not a personality trait a child chooses. It is an adaptation shaped by environment. When a child grows up in a space where emotional safety is uncertain, where anger, withdrawal, or unpredictability exists, the nervous system learns to stay alert. The child becomes sensitive to tone, mood, and unspoken signals, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. Pleasing becomes a way to reduce tension, to prevent conflict, to maintain connection. In such environments, love does not feel unconditional. Approval feels fragile, something that can be lost. So the child learns to monitor themselves constantly. They learn what is acceptable, what is too much, what must be hidden. Their own needs become secondary, not because they are unimportant, but because expressing them feels risky. Silence feels safer than honesty. Agreement feels safer than truth. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic, woven into identity. As the child grows into adulthood, the strategy remains, even when the original danger is gone. The body does not easily recognize that the threat has passed. Saying yes still feels like protection. Saying no still feels like rejection. The adult may appear generous, accommodating, endlessly patient, but inside there is often anxiety, fatigue, and a quiet fear of being disliked or abandoned. What others call kindness is often the absence of choice. This kind of pleasing is not rooted in freedom. It is rooted in fear. It is driven by the belief that belonging must be earned through useful emotional availability or self-sacrifice. The nervous system stays oriented toward others, scanning for cues, adjusting behavior, staying ahead of possible disconnection. Over time, this constant outward focus creates a disconnection from the self. Feelings become unclear. Desires become confusing. Resentment builds quietly, not because the person is unkind, but because they have learned to ignore their own limits for too long. True kindness arises from presence and choice. People pleasing arises from a body that once learned that safety depended on being agreeable, adaptable, and easy to love. The body keeps a precise record of every moment a person ignores their own needs in order to stay connected, accepted, or safe. Self-abandonment does not disappear simply because it is rationalized or normalized. It settles into the nervous system and the tissues. Each time someone says yes while feeling no, each time they silence discomfort to avoid conflict, the body tightens slightly, muscles hold, breathing shortens, the heart rate adjusts. Over years, these small adaptations become a constant state of tension. The body was never meant to live in continuous override. When emotional boundaries are crossed repeatedly without acknowledgement, the stress response stays active. Cortisol rises, sleep becomes shallow, digestion slows, immune function weakens. What appears as fatigue, brain fog, or chronic pain is often the physical expression of a life lived without enough permission to rest, to refuse, or to feel. The body speaks through symptoms when the voice has been suppressed for too long. Many people who abandon themselves are praised for their strength. They are the reliable ones, the listeners, the helpers. But reliability without reciprocity drains the system. The body begins to collapse in subtle ways. First, headaches, jaw tension, gut issues, frequent illness. These are not random malfunctions, they are communications. The body is signaling that it has been carrying emotional labor that was never meant to be borne alone. Emotions that are not expressed do not dissolve, they become physiological events. Unfelt anger can become inflammation. Unspoken grief can become heaviness in the chest. Chronic vigilance can become anxiety that never fully turns off. The body does not distinguish between emotional threat and physical danger. It responds to both with the same survival mechanisms. When self-abandonment becomes habitual, the body lives as though danger is always near. Healing begins not by forcing the body to relax, but by listening to what it has been enduring. When a person begins to honor their limits, speak their truth, and choose rest without guilt, the body slowly relearns safety. Tension softens, breath deepens, energy returns. The body does not demand perfection. It asks for honesty, presence, and the permission to stop carrying what was never meant to be carried alone. When the empath finally stops pleasing, the first sensation is rarely relief. It is guilt. a heavy, tightening feeling that arises the moment they choose themselves over someone else's comfort. This guilt can feel overwhelming, as if they have done something wrong simply by saying no, by pausing, by pulling back. But this guilt is not evidence of harm caused. It is evidence of an old emotional contract being broken. Beneath the guilt lies grief. Grief for the years spent believing love required constant giving. Grief for the parts of the self that learned to stay quiet, agreeable, and accommodating in order to belong. When pleasing ends, the empath is no longer numbing that grief through usefulness or emotional availability. The feelings that were postponed now come forward, asking to be felt. This grief also carries the pain of recognition. The empath begins to see how early they learn to monitor others instead of being met themselves. They see how often they absorbed responsibility for other people's emotions, mistaking attunement for obligation. Letting go of pleasing means letting go of the illusion that they could earn safety by managing everyone else's experience. That realization hurts. Guilt often appears because the nervous system associates boundaries with danger. In the past, asserting needs may have led to withdrawal, anger, or rejection. The body remembers this, even when the present no longer mirrors the past. So when the empath chooses themselves, the body reacts as if connection is being threatened. The guilt is a protective response, not a moral judgment. There is also grief for relationships that only existed because the empath was endlessly available. When pleasing stops, some connections weaken or disappear, and this can feel like loss, even when the loss brings relief. The empath may mourn not only the people, but the hope that one day they would be seen without having to disappear. As the grief is allowed, something begins to shift. The guilt softens, replaced by clarity. The empath starts to feel the difference between responsibility and self-betrayal. They begin to sense that love does not require constant sacrifice, and that boundaries are not acts of cruelty, but acknowledgments of truth. Grief, when honored, becomes the doorway through which authenticity returns. Boundaries act like light in a room that has long been lived in darkness. They do not change the nature of relationships. They reveal what has always been present but unseen. When a person begins to say no, to take space, or to express limits, the response they receive often tells the deeper story. Some people lean in with curiosity and respect. Others push back with guilt, anger, or withdrawal. This reaction is not about the boundary itself, but about what the relationship was built upon. Many connections form around roles rather than mutual presence. One person gives, listens, absorbs, adapts, while the other receives, relies, and expects. As long as these roles remain intact, the relationship appears stable. Boundaries disrupt this balance. They remove the unspoken agreement that one person will consistently put themselves second. When that agreement ends, discomfort surfaces. Those who value connection over control are willing to adjust. They may feel surprised or challenged, but they listen. They respect the shift, even if it requires change on their part. These relationships grow stronger through boundaries because they are rooted in mutual regard rather than convenience. The boundary becomes an invitation to meet each other honestly. Other relationships reveal fragility. The moment limits are expressed, accusations arise. You are called selfish, distant, or difficult. These reactions are not proof of wrongdoing. They are signs that access was mistaken for intimacy. When someone feels entitled to your time, energy, or emotional labor, a boundary feels like rejection rather than self-care. Boundaries also expose internal truths. They reveal how much of one's sense of belonging was tied to being needed. When resistance appears, it can awaken old fears of abandonment. But these fears are signals, not commands. They point to places where connection was conditional and where self-erasure was normalized. Over time, boundaries clarify who can remain present without requiring your disappearance. Some relationships end, not because boundaries destroyed them, but because there was nothing left once self-sacrifice was removed. Others deepen, becoming safer, more spacious, and more real. Boundaries do not create distance from love. They create distance from relationships that were never truly reciprocal, allowing genuine connection to finally take shape. Empathy without self-compassion often becomes a burden rather than a gift. When a person feels deeply but offers that understanding only outward, their sensitivity turns into exhaustion. They absorb the emotions of others, anticipate needs, and carry unspoken responsibility, while their own inner experience remains unattended. Over time, Empathy practiced without self-compassion can feel like weakness, not because caring is flawed, but because it is unprotected. Self-compassion changes the direction of empathy. It brings the same warmth, patience, and understanding inward that is so freely given to others. Instead of judging exhaustion, it asks what has been carried for too long. Instead of pushing through pain, it acknowledges it. This inward attention does not reduce empathy, it stabilizes it. When the nervous system feels met internally, it no longer needs to overextend to secure belonging. With self-compassion, empathy gains boundaries. The empath learns to distinguish between feeling with someone and feeling for someone at the cost of themselves. They recognize that understanding another's pain does not require absorbing it. Compassion becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. This shift allows empathy to exist without depletion, without resentment, without the quiet erosion of self. Self-compassion also softens the inner critic that often drives over giving. Many empaths carry a deep belief that their worth lies in how helpful, available, or understanding they are. When self-compassion enters, worth is no longer negotiated through sacrifice. The empath begins to treat their own limits with the same respect they offer others' struggles. Rest becomes legitimate. No becomes honest. Space becomes allowed. As this internal relationship strengthens, empathy transforms. It is no longer reactive or driven by fear of disconnection. It becomes grounded, present, and discerning. The empath can stay open without losing themselves. They can listen without fixing, care without rescuing, and support without abandoning their own needs. Strength does not emerge from emotional armor or detachment. It emerges from a regulated nervous system that knows it is worthy of care. Self-compassion provides that regulation. It creates an internal safety that allows empathy to flow freely without collapsing inward. In this way, sensitivity becomes resilient, care becomes sustainable, and empathy becomes a source of quiet, steady strength rather than chronic depletion. Stopping people pleasing can feel like turning away from others, but at its core it is a turning back toward oneself. For those who have spent years orienting their lives around others' needs, moods, and expectations, the absence of constant accommodation can feel like betrayal. Yet what is being betrayed is not others, but an old pattern that required the self to disappear in order to belong. People pleasing often begins as a way to preserve connection. It is a learned response to environments where love felt conditional and safety depended on being agreeable, useful, or emotionally available. Over time, this strategy becomes so ingrained that the self is gradually set aside. Desires are muted, limits are blurred, and the inner voice grows faint. When pleasing stops, the quiet that follows can feel unfamiliar, even frightening, because it reveals how long the self has been unattended. This shift is frequently misinterpreted as rejection. Others may feel confused or unsettled when access changes. Accusations of distance or coldness may arise, not because harm has been done, but because the relational dynamic has changed. The discomfort that surfaces is often the discomfort of adjustment, not evidence of wrongdoing. Choosing oneself does not automatically mean choosing against others. What actually occurs is a return to the body, where sensations and signals were long overridden. A return to emotions that were postponed in favor of harmony. A return to preferences, boundaries, and needs that once felt too dangerous to express. This reconnection is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of restoration. The self that was fragmented by constant adaptation begins to reassemble. As self-return deepens, relationships are clarified. Some connections cannot survive without self-erasure, and their loss can be painful, even when necessary. Other relationships adapt, becoming more honest and balanced. In these spaces, connection no longer relies on performance, but on presence. Stopping people pleasing does not sever bonds. It changes the terms of connection. It replaces obligation with choice, fear with clarity, and exhaustion with integrity. What is left is not rejection, but a reclaimed sense of self that no longer needs to disappear to be loved. So if you are an empath who feels tired, resentful, or invisible, know this. The moment you stop pleasing everyone is not the moment you lose love. It is the moment you finally stop losing yourself.